Today on Fresh Outlook, the Black Panthers and the Tea Party. Are you surprised to hear those two organizations together in the same sentence? One movement is at the extreme right, the other was at the far left. But are there any similarities in how those two groups have impacted broader American politics and culture? We're going to get some perspective on that issue today from our two guests. I'm going to begin by introducing at my far left, Kate Zernike. She's a national correspondent for the New York Times, and Kate's also written a book, Boiling Mad, Inside Tea Party America. Thanks for coming, Kate.
Thanks.
And we have also Dr. Yohuru Williams, who is a teacher of history at Fairfield University, and you are an author of several books, but among them, Black Politics, White Power, Civil Rights, Black Power, and Black Panthers in New Haven. Thank you also for coming today.
My pleasure.
Give us a little perspective on the Black Panther Party. Where did it come from and what happened to that?
Well, it's interesting because its origins are really in California in 1966 at the height of the Civil Rights Movement. And you have a burgeoning Black Power movement that grows up alongside the Civil Rights Movement, and the Panthers were a manifestation of that. It was formed by two college students, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, for the purpose of addressing what previously had been issues in the urban North and the West that hadn't been addressed by the traditional Southern Civil Rights Movement. And so they were looking to talk about things like housing, education, police brutality in an urban context, and to create a political agenda that would address those issues while dealing with what in California was a very significant issue, police brutality and the treatment of African Americans at the hands of the police.
To give us more of a basis then, Kate, can you juxtapose what the origins of the Tea Party movement is?
Very different. And I think most Tea Partiers would be surprised to hear these two mentioned in the same sentence. The Tea Party started in February of 2009. There had been some, as a protest against government bailouts and the stimulus program that was being proposed in particular, there had been some sort of scattered protests. But it was really in February of 2009 that Rick Santelli, who's a CNBC anchor, said, you know, he was talking about mortgage bailouts. He said, let's have a Chicago, you know, a Tea Party. We'll dump derivatives into Lake Michigan in Chicago. And people responded very quickly. I think a lot of libertarians and conservatives in particular, what they were responding to was this notion that the economy was in a hole, that people had spent more than that the country had spent more than it had. And to them, it didn't make sense that we were then going to spend money to try to get out of this economic hole. So it was a sense that the government was doing too much. The government was getting involved in car companies, and then eventually in health insurance, and in running in banks. So I think it was just a sense that the federal government was trying to do too much. And in many ways, it was sort of it was a leave us alone movement. It's very much saying, get the federal government out of our lives.
So what it sounds like is we're talking about an organization, movement, that was formed because of dissatisfaction with economic policy at the base, and then another organization that was formed because of racial issues, and they sound completely disparate, and yet there are people who are putting the two together and even asking whether the Tea Party is a new version of the Black Panther Party. Now, can you see where that might be coming from?
Well, I think part of that, what spawns that comparison is the fact that both organizations, the Tea Party and the Black Panthers, had a deep engagement with the Constitution and American history in talking about armed self-defense. So the Panthers began as the Black Panther Party for self-defense, and they encouraged the carrying of firearms to protest against what they perceived to be.
They even had that as part of the uniform originally, didn't they?
Absolutely, yes. And the Tea Party, because there's been so much talk about a second American Revolution, invoking this imagery from the American Revolution, talking about the Second Amendment, people are making a comparison that this discussion of armed self-defense or armed resistance obviously evokes the Black Panthers, evokes that historical moment. And so obviously that's one comparison, although there are others.
Well, what do you think, Kate? I mean, is it the grassroots element of it too?
I think so. I mean, I think most Tea Partiers are not showing up to meetings with guns. Sorry. You know, when you looked at exit polls after the election, or on election day, 4 in 10 Americans said they supported the Tea Party movement. So it's really it's got quite a broad base. And I think the mistake that a lot of people made early on was presuming that this was only sort of, you know, people who cared most about their gun rights living in sort of rural Idaho. I think it's much more widespread than that. Where I do think there's a comparison, though, is what you hear, and so many people in my book talk about this. They looked at actually what the left was doing, and they really admired it, and they really modeled the Tea Party on that. They looked at community organizing, in which, of course, President Barack Obama had been a community organizer. And they tried to model that. They want to be community organizers.
You know what, I want to stop at that point because I'd like to pick up on that when we come back. There are some similarities in methodology with the two groups. So We're going to continue our discussion in just a moment. We hope you'll stay here with us. Today I'm here on Fresh Outlook with Kate Zernike and Dr. Yohuru Williams, and we're talking about the Black Panther Party, the Tea Party movement, and how those two seemingly very different organizations do share some common methods of operation and even some common goals, in that they were both trying to change the society and the function of government at the time. Kate, when we stopped our conversation, you were just talking a little bit about the different methods used to get the message across by the Tea Party and how some of them are similar to the Black Panthers' methods. Can you continue with that?
Well, in particular, one woman in my book in particular struck me that when she tried to get involved with her local Republican Party in the election of 2008, and she felt that they were not receptive to her, so she went home and she signed up for emails from MoveOn.org, not because she'd become a left-wing organizer overnight, but because she wanted to see how they were operating. And she really admired the organizing that they had done, and she wanted to find what she called the move on of the right. And so that was sort of, and many people I talked to when I was researching the Tea Party mentioned this, that they wanted to be the move on of the right. And what they really admire is the use of social media, and in particular just sort of the pressure that these groups were brought to bear. And I think what we've seen since the midterms is that the Tea Party is trying to be sort of another pressure group on the Republican Party.
And certainly the Black Panthers attempted to exert pressure, and it was based on feeling excluded also.
Absolutely. The same can be said of the Panthers. And one of the things that I love about Kate's book is that she talks about the Tea Party as being innovators in terms of looking at how they use social networking, for example, to get the message out. The Panthers were great organizers, as were organizations like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, because they found ways to reach people in communities who had previously been ignored or alienated, marginalized by the government. And what's interesting about the Panthers, and this is another comparison I think people don't often make between the two organizations, is that the Panthers at a certain point came to the conclusion that the federal government wasn't capable of addressing the issues that were impacting the Black community. And if there was going to be meaningful change, it was up to the people in the community to sponsor that change. So you see this transition from the Panthers talking about government responsibility to community responsibility. We don't want the government to provide breakfast for school children. We'll create our own breakfast for school children program. And so there is this kind of neat parallel with these two organizations who are both saying we have problems with the government, we have doubts about the government's ability to address the needs of the people. In the case of the Tea Party, obviously it's turned into kind of some element of an anti-government discourse. But in the course of the Panthers, it turned into this really wonderful and very meaningful engagement with how people could become more involved and active in their community, which we're seeing with the Tea Party as well now.
So are we seeing both of these turn from first loosely formed organizations and another very specific one into something much broader, much bigger than what they began as? Or are we actually turning into a full-fledged social movement that's changing society around it?
Well, I think when you look at polls, you find that there are very few, a relatively small number of Americans who've actually been to a Tea Party meeting or belong to a Tea Party group. Where you see this huge impact, though, is what I mentioned before, the number of people in exit polls who say they're Tea Party supporters. So they've sort of captured, I think they've captured an emotion that's happening right now, and I think they've captured that because the economy is in the place that it is. There's the sense that the federal government is doing too much, local taxpayers are ending up having to pay for it, and there's not enough money to go around.
Do you think the Black Panther Party?
Absolutely. The Panthers' numbers were never high. And so the argument was always, J. Edgar Hoover described them as a #1 threat to the internal security of the United States government in 1969. And yet their core membership probably never extended beyond a couple thousand members, if that. But the argument was, if you looked at the polls at the time, people said they expressed an appreciation for what the Panthers were trying to accomplish. And I think in that sense, both of these organizations have made a tremendous contribution, because what they're doing is getting people talking about the issues. And hopefully at the same time, changing the political discourse, as the Panthers did in 68, 69, and 70, as the Tea Party is doing today.
Is that then how you gauge the success of the Black Panther movement?
Ultimately, for an organization like the Panthers, yes, because it's difficult to determine. We can look at the longevity of programs, we can look at their cultural impact, but their social and political impact are usually going to be the longest and the deepest. I think when we look at, and again, these are things that Kate talks about in Boiling Mad, when we look at the long-term impact of the Tea Party, I think we'll see some substantive changes in terms of the political process, and the same that we saw at the turn of the century with groups like the populists and the progressives. So these are both very important political moments and political movements.
But the Black Panther Party has basically disappeared from the scene, has it not?
It's disappeared, but its reverberations are still being felt, which is why people are making it a comparison to the Tea Party. And so I think that's the neat piece, is that allows us to see that this is kind of a circular discourse in American politics, and one that involves looking at both extreme groups on the far left and far right, and how they're contributing to, and this is one of the things that I do appreciate about the Tea Party, this engagement or deeper engagement with the Constitution. What are the meanings of these founding documents? Why are they so significant to us? What do they tell us about our DNA as a nation, as a people? And ultimately, what do they say about American citizenship and our responsibility as citizens? So all those things, again, are very important.
There are some people who are expressing outrage that this comparison would even be made. And Kate, what do you think about that? Would any Tea Partiers feel outraged themselves at being compared to the Black Panther Party of the past?
Oh, absolutely. And, you know, when Glenn Beck had his big rally on the Mall in August, there was talk that the Black Panthers were going to be there trying to sort of intimidate people from going to this rally. And there was a huge outcry. You know, if you looked at Tea Party websites, Tea Party blogs, they were talking about this, and it was very much this, you know, the Black Panthers as this big scary thing. So,
well, and the Tea Party is often tagged as being very racist, although I don't think they themselves
no, they
feel
absolutely
that way at
don't.
all.
They absolutely don't feel that way at all. And I don't think that race is the motivating factor for most Tea Partiers.
So you do think that they would feel that there's a discomfort level at being compared to the Black Panther Party?
I think so, but I think they would probably take the comparison to left-wing organizations and see it as fair, if not exactly what they've been after. I mean, again, Sarah Palin made community organizer a term of derision in 2008. Well, a lot of the Tea Partiers actually think, no, I want to be a community organizer. That's that's the best thing I can do, is get out there, knock on doors, and that's how they won a lot of these elections. That's how they won, how they ended up nominating Christine O'Donnell in Delaware, despite the fact that the establishment was against them. They went out, they knocked on doors, they made phone calls. It was very grassroots.
Well, we're going to take a little break here, and when we come back, what I'd like to talk about is how much of an impact, for example, the Black Panther Party has had in a broader context socially, and what we can expect of the Tea Party as well. So we're going to continue our conversation in just a couple of moments. We're back with Kate Zernike of the New York Times and Dr. Yohuru Williams of Fairfield University, and we're talking about the Black Panther Party and the Tea Party movement and how they fit into our societal picture as a whole. And we had just talked about how some of the Tea Party members really don't care to be compared necessarily to the Black Panther Party. And in turn, how do people who empathize with the Black Panther Party, how do they feel about being compared?
They're not happy either.
Nobody's happy.
Exactly. Part of the problem there is that there is this very strong perception that the Tea Party is racist at its core.
Where does that come from?
Well, part of it is the birther movement and the fact that all of this anger seems to have been occasioned by the election of the nation's first Black president. Some of the rhetoric that we find coming out of the Tea Party, certainly when you have Glenn Beck's rally that Kate referred to, where you're approximating the symbolism of a Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, and so much of this seems to be what appears to be racist-driven language and symbols. Those are things that obviously are going to make people uncomfortable, particularly people who were part of a movement in the 60s that had as its core racial integration.
But it sounds like it would offend African Americans as a whole, really.
Deeply, deeply offends African Americans. Although it's interesting because some prominent members of the Tea Party are people, Dr. King's family, for example. There are certain people who have supported the Tea Party. And that's why it's important for us, and Kate does a wonderful job of this, but very few journalists talk about this, and it's very important to separate the issues, that anger that percolated over the edge in 2008 and what people were responding to from some of the messengers. And that's difficult for any social movement. We see that historically. And so what's happened is the two have become conflated. And so a lot of the resentment, the anger, the uncomfortability that African Americans have with the message is associated with those people who've been out making this a central part of the Tea Party identity.
And not to spend too much time talking just about the Tea Party structure, but do you think part of that comes from the lack of a central body that actually represents the Tea Party? You've got all these individuals, and they've all got their own opinions, and they're all being thrown about as representative of the party as a whole.
Right. So what that means is that there's no one really in the center to say, no, we don't stand for that, or no, we don't agree with that. And I think also, part of what they're talking about is states' rights. And when people hear states' rights, they think slavery, they think the Civil War. So it is, again, sort of the language that they're using. Let
me ask you, Yohuru, about the broader impact that the Black Panther Party had on America. Right down to hairstyles. I mean, they really did leave their mark.
They did, and I think in some interesting ways, in ways that we're not always aware. For example, Operation Head Start, which the government took over, was a Panther program that actually helped to bring breakfast to school children all over the country. Their cultural references to the Panthers are pretty significant. And Kate referred to one which is actually really, really powerful. And it's the fact that there's still a lot of fear about what the Panthers represented. People saw them as armed revolutionaries.
Yeah, very militaristic.
Absolutely. And so there is still this lingering fear about if someone is identified with the Black Panther Party, what does that mean? Because these were people that wanted to overthrow the United States government. In fact, nothing could be further from the truth. By the 1970s, the Panthers as an organization had embraced constitutionalism. They ran Bobby Seale for mayor of Oakland, California. So they were involved in American politics very deeply. They had changed as an organization and matured and grown. And so it's really, again, sifting through the history of that movement and understanding how it grew and progressed and then seeing the depth of that comparison today.
You know, with the Tea Party, we have yet to see how this is going to play out, but there are a lot of people who say no doubt it's going to have an impact on future elections, particularly 2012. But do you think there are ramifications beyond that, that we're going to see other things change societally because of their impact?
Well, I think it's just impacted the debate already. I think that that the focus on the debt and on the deficit and on government spending and on the role of government, I think that's all very new. Or not, it's not very new, but it's the emphasis is renewed, I should say. When you looked at the campaign of 2010, there wasn't a lot of talk about social issues. There was not a lot of talk about gay marriage. We've just seen the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So it's pushed, I think the discussion that the Tea Party has pushed of economic conservatism has pushed aside a lot of the social conservative issues.
Do you think that the Tea Party is going to emerge somehow as a third party, or is it going to align itself more with Republicans, or? No,
these are Republicans. They're generally they describe themselves as Republicans and conservative Republicans. Most Tea Partiers don't have any desire to start a third party because they feel that third parties don't work. They feel they can have a greater impact in kind of taking over the Republican Party.
Well, I want to talk a little bit more about the future in this last and final segment of our program. It flies by quickly, but we hope you'll stay with us. We're going to be back in just a couple of moments. Today we're talking about two movements in America that had a great impact on the country, one of them being the Tea Party, and Kate has written about that. And Kate, in the break we were talking just a little bit about some of the impact that you do think the Tea Party has had, even in terms of other groups sort of emulating the Tea Party's approach to affecting change.
Well, I think the Tea Party has talked a lot about the Constitution and sort of reclaiming the mantle of the Founding Fathers, so I think other groups, and particularly groups on the left, are starting to say, hey, wait a minute, that doesn't belong to you. We too can talk about the Constitution. We too can talk about the Founding Fathers. We too reflect their vision. And so I think there is sort of more of a focus on that.
You know, I want to talk about the success of each of these organizations, and I realize some of it's ongoing, but with regard to the Black Panthers, let me just read a little quote here. The Black Panther Party forced white America to rethink of blacks as successful people, as professionals, and it's about the visibility of Black America. Do you think that is what they've achieved? Does it go even beyond that?
I think the civil rights movement and the Black Power movements did that, and the Panthers were one small part of those two larger movements. I think what the Panthers did was to wake America up to the possibility that there were going to be extremists on the far left, African Americans, who were going to look outside government solutions to address issues that impacted the African American community. The Panthers occupy a pretty unique place in American history because they're, the anti-heroes of a very popular movement, of a very popular moment. We can all celebrate a Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. The Panthers are more problematic for people because unless you really deeply study them, they represent, or they've come to represent, everything that was wrong about the 1960s. Extremism, radicalism, so on and so forth. And yet at their core, they were in this very deep discourse with the Founding Fathers about the nature of American democracy. Point number 10 of the Panthers' 10-point program actually is a restatement of the Declaration of Independence. They're quoting Jefferson, and they're quoting Jefferson because they're saying, we have a stake, we lay our claim to this legacy as well.
It's still another similarity, it strikes me.
Yeah.
Is it too early, Kate, to proclaim the Tea Party a successful movement? Did I say too early or too late? Too early.
No, I think it's absolutely. I mean, I think if you look at the results of the 2010 midterms, absolutely they were successful. I mean, they were far more successful than I anticipated in the number of candidates running for House seats who won. I mean, I think in the Senate they had less of an impact, but in the House they won more seats than I would have expected.
Is there anybody who is now carrying the torch on behalf of the Black Panther Party? We talked a little bit in a break about the new Black Panther Party, but you said it's different. Very different.
In the original Panthers, people like Bobby Seale, who was the chairman of the party, Elaine Brown, who at one point took over the organization, are very careful about distinguishing the Panthers' legacy from the new Black Panther Party. And so that's very important. It's interesting when you talk about cultural reverberations too. If we look at music, movies, culture, and people often say journalism is the first draft of history, we can already see that the Tea Party is going to have a significant impact, because it'll be difficult for anybody to talk about this moment in American history, to understand Obama in context, or the backlash against the war, the Great Recession, as Kate calls it. It's going to be difficult to talk about any of that without talking about the Tea Party, just as it's impossible to talk about the 60s without talking about the Black Panthers.
It does seem over time, though, that movements, however strongly they may begin, they do kind of soften a little bit and eventually dissipate somehow. I don't know whether they're absorbed or they just achieve their goals and people move on and the torch may not be carried exactly as they had intended. Do you see that happening, Kate, with the Tea Party?
Absolutely. Look, I think, again, as I said, there's a fairly small core of people who are actually involved in the Tea Party, going to Tea Party rallies, involved in Tea Party activities. Where it had such an impact was in the number of people who called themselves Tea Party supporters. I think a lot of those people came to the Tea Party movement, or came to sympathize with it, because they felt that again, the economy was out of control, the government was trying to do too much, the government was spending too much money. So as the economy begins to get better, I think that the rawness of that feeling will fade, and therefore there won't be this immediacy to it.
So Yohuru, what will be the lasting legacy of movements like this?
Social movements have been very important. It's interesting when you talked about third parties earlier, because third parties historically have not done well in American politics, but they have really substantively changed the nature of American democracy. The Populist Party and the Progressives helped to introduce things like the referendum and the recall. We get constitutional amendments that grow out of third-party movements. So it's important for us to recognize that these movements are significant, not in their ability always to elect people or to actually win the ultimate goal, which is the presidency, but to change the way that we think about our citizenship, the way that we think about our government and its responsibilities, the way that we think about each other. And I think that's one of the cornerstones of all this, is that as uncomfortable as anyone may be with the Tea Party, we can all celebrate that this is democracy at work. This is how it's supposed to work.
You agree, Kate?
I do agree, absolutely. And I think, we've seen movements on the left that are very similar, and I think some people on the left would celebrate those movements. So I think they in fairness, have to celebrate this when we see it on the right, because it is, as you say, this is the democratic process.
Well, Kate Zernike and Dr. Yohuru Williams, thank you both very much for being here today.
Thank you.
On the surface, it seems these groups couldn't be more different. But what they might share is that common desire to fix what they see as broken. In this case, their very country. And perhaps what they leave us with is a fresh outlook. Thank you for watching. We'll see you again next time.